Hello and welcome to the Fit to Transform podcast, where you learn how to train and diet effectively and, most importantly, how to maintain those results for life, once and for all. I'm Nikias Tomasiello, a transgender training and nutrition coach working online with anyone who's ready for a true lifestyle transformation, anywhere they may be in the world. As a friendly reminder, any and all information provided is for educational purposes only. You should consult with your doctor before implementing any changes to your diet and exercise program. With that disclaimer out of the way, thank you for being here. Now grab yourself a cup of tea or pre-workouts and enjoy. Yo, welcome back to the podcast. Today I'm talking to Dr. Eric Trexler about artificial or non-nutritive sweeteners. On the 14th of July 2023, the WHO published a news release titled Aspartame Hazard and Risk Assessment Results, which sparked quite a bit of talk on social media. That's why I decided to invite Dr. Eric Trexler on the show for the second time to clarify what the deal with aspartame and artificial sweeteners is once and for all, at least for now, until new evidence comes out. If you haven't listened to my first interview with him, you'll find it split into episodes 15 and 16. It's another illuminating conversation on how to adapt a vegan or vegetarian dietary pattern to maximize fat loss and muscle growth. But now, without further ado, let's get into today's interview about artificial sweeteners and aspartame. Yo, welcome back to the podcast, dear listeners. Today I have Dr. Eric Trexler back with me to talk all things artificial sweeteners and, in particular, aspartame. Eric, welcome. Oh, thank you so much. Welcome so much. That's what I was going to say, which is also true. But thank you very much for being back.
Of course, yeah. Thanks for having me back. I'm very happy to be here.
Excellent. So, since the last time we talked, your professional life underwent quite a big change, and I wanted to give you some space to talk about it with the audience.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I finished my PhD at the very end of 2018. And from 2019 to 2000 until like a month ago, I was doing a whole bunch of stuff outside of the academic world. So I was still doing a little bit of research, publishing a little bit here and there, but that was mostly in my free time. And, during the work week, I was spending a lot of time on a nutrition app, doing a lot of content creation, working kind of outside of academia. But about a month ago, I went back into academia. So I got a research position at Duke University. I'm in their Department of Evolutionary Anthropology, and it's a really fantastic laboratory with tremendous opportunities to get a better understanding of human energy expenditure, which is something that has really fascinated me for a long time. So the lab that I'm joining as a researcher, we'll be able to run really cool studies to try to figure out why our metabolism adapts the way that it does in a variety of different conditions.
That is so fascinating. I remember reading Dr. Ponser's research on metabolism through the ages from about, if I'm not wrong, it was from about 20 years old, or even no, from childhood all the way to 60 years old plus, and how the metabolism is affected by the way we age, and it was incredibly fascinating to me. So I'm really looking forward to finding out what kind of research you guys are going to put out in the future.
Yeah, and that paper you're referring to, they had participants that ranged from a few months, or actually a few weeks old, all the way up to, I believe, 96. So like the entire human lifespan, which is really fantastic.
Yeah, exactly. I thought that was amazing, and it was an incredible piece of research.
Yeah.
Anyway, before we get both too nerdy about this, what we're here to talk about today is, first of all, artificial sweeteners in general, before we move into the news about aspartame recently released by the WHO. So what I'm going to do is I am going to play the role of the concerned consumer Ken, who, according to Google, is apparently the male equivalent of Karen. You are going to play the role of expert Dr. Eric Trexler, and I am going to express my concerns to you, and we can cover whether they're fact, whether they're myth, and whether we actually ought to be worried about artificial sweeteners. Are you ready?
Yes, I just saw the Barbie movie yesterday, so when you're Ken, I'm gonna try to think of you as some alternative kind of form of a Karen and not just Ken from Barbie. So I'll do my very best with that.
I think you can imagine me as Ken from Barbie. I wouldn't be opposed to looking like Ryan Gosling, to be fair, and
You
having a
would,
shirt
yeah.
that says "I am Kenaf."
Yeah, there you go.
All right, so I'm gonna get my Ken shirt on, and I'm gonna get ready. So, Doctor Flexer, I think that's your name, right?
Again, I'd go for it. Sounds good to me.
Excellent. So I am Ken. I've been looking into artificial sweeteners, and I have a few questions now because I've done a lot of research, and I have very trustworthy sources like Wikipedia and The Onion, and I really need to know what the deal with these artificial sweeteners is. So first off, the name already gives me weird vibes, artificial sweeteners. So what that implies is that they're full of chemicals. And so I'm wondering, does that make them worse than natural sweeteners? How does that work?
So the answer is no. There's nothing wrong with artificial sweeteners per se, but that weird kind of vague, icky feeling that we get when we hear that something is an artificial chemical. That is an example of the appeal to nature fallacy, and it's a logical fallacy where we just kind of have a tendency to assume something that's natural is healthy or good for us, and something that's unnatural or artificial is necessarily going to be bad for us or unhealthy. And of course, that's not the case. There are a lot of tremendously valuable medications that are synthetic in origin that are remarkably helpful for human health. And some of the most potent toxins in the world are perfectly natural. So while it is tempting to fall into that trap, it is still a trap.
Very interesting. This fallacy, schmallacy business is definitely something that I need to look out for then in my future research. But thank you for clarifying that. I think you've convinced me so far. Let's look at some other potential concerns that I've come across. For example, so let's say that I agree with you, or rather I believe you, and artificial sweeteners will not kill me because they're artificial. But I have heard that they can make you gain body fat, and I'm wondering if this is true.
So the answer is no. It is not true. However, there is a dangerously misleading kind of grain of truth to that statement if you kind of mess with it a little bit. So there are some observational studies where they find that consumption of artificial sweeteners is correlated with higher weight or BMI or body fat. So people who weigh more and have more body fat tend to be people who consume more artificial sweeteners. So that gives people that little grain of truth where they can say, "See, I told you artificial sweeteners are going to make you gain fat because how did these people become folks with more body fat or more body weight? They gained it over time, right?" So that is again kind of a tempting fallacy to fall into, to assume that there's this kind of very straightforward longitudinal sequence of events where artificial sweeteners cause weight gain or fat gain. But the reality is more likely inverted. So the more likely scenario is that people who have more body weight and more body fat decide to make dietary changes to reduce their body weight or lose body fat. And so it's more likely that people adopt the use of artificial sweeteners after they have gained that weight rather than gaining the weight because they adopted the use of artificial sweeteners. And both of those are kind of, whichever way you want to draw that arrow is kind of up to you. But fortunately, we have randomized controlled trials that we can lean on. So we have studies that are much higher quality forms of evidence, and they take the guesswork out of it. And what we do is we take two groups of people who are very similar, group A and group B. One group is assigned to consume artificial sweeteners. The other to consume, depending on the study, they might just be having water. They might be having a sugar sweetened beverage that's equivalent in volume and taste and things like that. But we have these randomized controlled trials where we actually can make inferences about what's causing what. And what we find in randomized controlled trials with artificial sweeteners is that they either have a neutral effect on body weight or they induce a little bit of weight loss rather than weight gain. So, if you're trying to manage your body weight, artificial sweeteners seem to either have no impact or they seem to help a little bit. They certainly don't seem to hurt.
So let me know if I got this right. We know from observational studies that there is some sort of association between people with in larger bodies with extra body fat and the consumption of artificial sweeteners. But from the observational studies alone, we don't know what that means. Is it, do they gain weight because of the artificial sweeteners, or are they choosing to consume those after gaining the weight? And you're telling me that then we did research to find out which way we need to point that arrow. And what we did was we actually gave people artificial sweeteners and compared them to people who did not have these artificial sweeteners. And so we could see if what the association would be. And we found out that there was no body fat gain associated with them. And if anything, a little bit of weight loss. Is that right?
That is correct.
Perfect. Okay. So concern number 2 allayed. Now, concern number 3 is, okay, they're not going to kill me. They're not going to make me gain body fat, but they're still sweet, but they have no sugar. So I'm wondering, is that going to trick the body into expecting that there will be calories coming from sugar getting into my body at any point?
Yeah, so this is a really common idea. You hear people talk about it a lot, and intuitively, I do think it sounds plausible at face value. But luckily, we do have some research that we can lean on that largely alleviates this type of concern. And the concern is really linked to that idea about artificial sweeteners causing weight gain. A lot of
Mm.
folks are of the impression that if your body can sense, hey, that kind of tasted and felt like I consumed about 35 grams of sugar, but where's the sugar? The idea is then you would kind of seek out more calories so that your body can kind of make sense of what just happened and say, hey, where'd those calories go? And so then that would be something that kind of promotes additional weight gain as you're seeking out these extra calories. That's the thought process. And one way that we could look at that is we can look at postprandial responses to what happens when a person actually consumes artificial sweeteners. We can look at, for example, if you're consuming a bunch of artificial sweetened beverage, for example, do we see this huge spike in insulin, this massive drop in blood glucose, some of these parameters that would actually give us some physiological hints that your body actually is reacting as if it just had sugar, but there's none there. And so then, you would be in this kind of low glucose state where, yeah, you would kind of feel like lethargic, hungry, things like that. So there are some of these kind of physiological clues when we look at some of these postprandial responses to ingestion that we could use to kind of piece that story together in a more scientific way. And the studies that have tried to do that largely have failed. And so what I mean by that is when we see people consume a big dose of artificial sweeteners, something like an entire soda, in terms of the equivalent sweetness, we really don't see much in terms of glycemic responses. We do not see massive increases in insulin. We don't see massive drops in blood glucose. And so when we look at whether we're looking at single meals or kind of long-term adaptations to regular consumption, glycemic control doesn't really seem to be impacted all that much. There are isolated studies here or there that kind of point to maybe some tiny clinically irrelevant effects, but broadly speaking, we do have the evidence to kind of check that, kind of assess that possibility. And all the evidence that we have really goes the other way. We don't see that people have these really unusual postprandial responses after ingestion. And we also don't see that people have really large elevations in appetite, desire to eat, anything like that. It tends to be whether we're looking at glycemic responses or appetite responses, things of that nature, fairly neutral in general.
I'm glad you brought up the glycemic control because I was going to ask you about that next. So it sounds like in the short term, they don't seem to really have a large effect. Can they have any impact on glycemic control over the long term?
So far the studies would indicate probably not. Like anything, humans are different. We're looking at parameters in the human body that change moment to moment. So of course you're going to get a random study here or there that shows, slightly atypical responses relative to the rest of the literature. But broadly speaking, we really don't see much in terms of the independent effect of artificial sweeteners on glycemic control over time. So if we took two groups of folks who had pretty normal glycemic control, one got artificial sweeteners, the other did not. Both of those groups maintained all their other habits the same in terms of diet, exercise, things like that. We really wouldn't see anything at all. What's really interesting is, this idea. I'm glad you brought up the idea of the kind of prolonged long-term effect because it actually goes the opposite direction in many cases. So artificial sweeteners are not like, you know, the secret weapon to weight management. I mean, they're not going to have in most cases, they're not going to have a really potent independent effect on weight loss where they're just driving really tremendous amounts of weight loss. But a lot of times artificial sweeteners can have a very modest benefit in terms of weight loss, and they can be combined as part of a broader weight management program to induce weight loss. And so if you're someone who's starting out, maybe you're kind of on the borderline of type 2 diabetes, you've got some insulin resistance, your glycemic control is kind of drifting out of that optimal range, and you're someone who uses artificial sweeteners regularly as part of a broader weight management program, you might actually see the opposite. So you might see that over time, as you're losing weight and improving your cardiometabolic health, you actually have improved glycemic control rather than impaired glycemic control. And artificial sweeteners can absolutely be part of that.
Oh, excellent answer. Thank you for explaining. Now, my last concern on artificial sweeteners in general has to do with the gut microbiome. I've heard that they can be bad for your gut health, and I'm wondering how true that statement might be.
Yeah, so the gut microbiome is really interesting. There's a lot of research going into it, and for good reason. It's this kind of new frontier of health and physiology research. I say new, and people are saying, "Well, I've heard about that for the last 5 or 10 years," but research moves slow. If something's only been, if we've only really been digging into it for a little bit there, that's new enough to call it new in the science world. And one of the reasons I kind of emphasize how new it is because when we are interpreting the results of these studies, we still really don't know what to make of them. So it's very easy to say, hey, your, microbiome profile in terms of the relative breakdown of these different microbial species within your GI tract. Usually we're measuring that from fecal samples. We can say, hey, it looks different now than it did the first time we checked. And sometimes we can attribute that to some intervention, whether it's eating more of this, eating less of that, you get the idea. But rarely can we actually draw a clear line from that change that we observed to some relevant, clinically meaningful outcome. So we can say, hey, the microbes in your fecal sample look different than they used to, but we can't necessarily say that's a good thing or a bad thing. We can't necessarily say because of this we can expect some other more relevant outcome to you related to your blood sugar, your blood pressure, some kind of relevant cardiometabolic health outcome. We can't draw a straight line to weight loss or weight gain. It's very, very complicated. And there's even some papers indicating that within the same person, if we just take a fecal sample and then do it again later with no intervention whatsoever, we see massive variation in the gut microbiome profile of the same exact person in two measurements taken relatively close in time. So even within a particular person who's not doing any intervention to change their behaviors, we will see really large changes in their gut microbiome profile sometimes. So all of that is to kind of preface this conversation with, we often see changes in interventions. They may or may not be related to the actual intervention that was implemented, and we rarely know what that actually means in tangible terms. We can just say, hey, it's kind of like those those like quizzes where they say, hey, what's different in this picture versus that picture? Like, we can point out that a thing is different, but we can't really say, hey, that picture is meaningfully better or worse than the other one. We can just kind of point out, hey, something looks a little different here. So when it comes to artificial sweeteners, one of the challenges with this is that to determine the effect of artificial sweeteners on the gut microbiome, that question alone would have to cause us, we'd have to get on board with the assumption that artificial sweeteners are a thing, and they're really not. So I sometimes call them artificial sweeteners because that's the common term, but a better term is probably non-nutritive sweeteners, meaning sweeteners with low enough calories that we don't bother to count them or really track them. And the reason I say that is because stevia is not artificial in nature. It's kind of a natural, non-nutritive sweetener, which doesn't mean it's healthier or less healthy, as we talked about with that appeal to nature fallacy. But when we look at non-nutritive sweeteners, we are looking at a diverse category of compounds. Aspartame, sucralose, stevia. There are several others, and they're not the same thing, and they're really not close. It's not like we're looking at molecules that are almost identical with just these little tiny differences that are functionally irrelevant. We are looking at completely different things here. It's kind of like saying, what is the health profile of some depression medication? And it's like, well, it could be a medication from several different categories with completely different mechanisms of action, right? These are not little derivations of the exact same thing. We have some really distinct things out here that are not, we can't assume that one is representative of the other. So that's an issue with non-nutritive sweeteners for any outcome, is that if you really want to know the effect of non-nutritive sweeteners, we have to have several studies for each individual one. And when it comes to the gut microbiome, we really don't. Most of the research we have pertaining to the gut microbiome, a lot of it is coming from aspartame, and a little bit is coming from sucralose, which is most known for the brand name Splenda. So aspartame, sucralose, we've got some research for those two. The others, we really just don't have much. But from what we can gather from the aspartame data and the little bit of sucralose data, in some studies, you see a statistically significant change in the gut microbiome profile. In others, you do not. When a statistically significant change is observed, it tends not to be particularly dramatic in terms of magnitude, and it is, in my judgment, highly unlikely that the change we see is going to be clinically relevant in any way. It is unlikely to have any meaningful impact on, metabolic health, risk of any kind of disease state. It's unlikely to be associated with any gastrointestinal symptoms of any kind. All we can say is that, the profile looks slightly different. There's more of this bacterium, less of that bacterium, or strain of bacteria. And that's about all we can say about it. Is sometimes there's a very slight, probably irrelevant change, and then sometimes there isn't. So when I'm consuming an artificial sweetener or a non-nutritive sweetener, the thought of its impact on my gut microbiome just doesn't really cross my mind at all, because it just seems far too minor in magnitude and consistency to really give it much thought.
Thank you very much for that very exhaustive answer. So you essentially convinced me that I should not listen to the Onion and Wikipedia about all of these concerns on on nutritive or artificial sweeteners, but I think, Dr. Flexer, I'm gonna have you with the next question because my source this time is none other than the WHO, which on the 14th of July released a statement, which I'm gonna put in the show notes, and it was titled Aspartame Hazard and Risk Assessment Results. And in these statements, they said that they classified, well, when I say they, the agency, the International Agency for Research on Cancer, IARC, classified aspartame as, in quotes, possibly carcinogenic to humans, IARC Group 2B. Now, if the WHO says that, that must be concerning. So, what does that mean exactly?
So yeah, that story has been all over the news the last month or so. And to directly answer your question, what does that mean? Uh, I think my most concise answer would be probably not much. Okay. And I know a lot of people will be surprised by that because when you hear that something is carcinogenic, usually you start to worry about that. You say, well, I should probably avoid that. But the details are really important here. So the IARC, International Agency for Research on Cancer, that's the group that you mentioned. They are affiliated with the World Health Organization, and they basically maintain a list of carcinogens, and they divide it into four categories. So, group one, these are just basically known carcinogens. It's stuff that can cause cancer in humans. Group 2A is what they call probably carcinogenic to humans, meaning we kind of feel like this probably can cause cancer in humans, but we're not quite certain enough to say it with, a high level of confidence. Even lower than that is group 2B, and that is possibly carcinogenic to humans. And that is where we find aspartame based on this recent review of the evidence. So, and then below that is a category of things that just aren't classifiable. So they're still kind of on that maybe, possibly, but who knows kind of tier of this list. But if we look closely at 2B, what that really means is that there's some evidence that it can cause cancer in humans, but at the present moment, it is far from conclusive. And if you dig into how some other organizations kind of reframe or rephrase that, some that kind of dig into exactly how these determinations are made, uh, the bar for classifying something as a category or group 2B possible carcinogen, it's really not a high bar. It does not mean like, wow, there was a really strong study in humans that shows extremely robust evidence for causation, and we should all be super concerned about this. That's really not what 2B is made for as a category. Uh, Something can be put in group 2B if for example there is a study where there's kind of a correlation between cancer and intake in humans, and then maybe a rodent study where it caused some cancer, or in the most extreme cases they can actually justify putting something in group 2B based purely on mechanistic evidence. So if they just say, well, they're based on this mechanism, there should be a way that it can cause cancer in humans, even without rodent data or human data or animal data of any kind, that they theoretically could put something in group 2B based on mechanistic evidence alone. And so I think that leads into the question of, well, what exactly is going on? Why did we get here? Why are they looking at this in the first place? And the answer is there were a couple studies within the last couple years that reported some correlations between uh, aspartame intake and artificial sweetener intake and cancer prevalence in humans. But observational data is, especially with dietary factors, notoriously, I don't want to say unreliable because that's not the right word, but there is an expected level of inconsistency. I think that's a fair way to put it. So, for example, there was a paper in 2013, I believe, by Schoenfeld and Ioannidis, And their conclusion was kind of a tongue-in-cheek statement that everything we eat both causes and prevents cancer. Because the point they were making is, in some of these observational nutritional epidemiology papers, for a given food, we can find evidence of a fairly strong uh, or a fairly large increase in cancer risk and a fairly large reduction in cancer risk if we're just looking from one paper to another. So when it comes to making sense of these observational studies with dietary ingredients or food groups or whatever the case may be, we really need to rely on a pretty broad body of evidence with replicated findings. We need to see some pretty conclusive stuff. Um, so that's one of the reasons they were looking into this. Another reason is there were a couple rodent studies. One in 2005, I think, somewhere between 2005 and 2007. The same research group put out two studies in rodents linking aspartame intake to the development of certain forms of cancer in these rodents. Um, and so, based on, and there are of course some plausible mechanisms by which aspartame theoretically could give rise to cancer. And so, there's kind of a little bit of human stuff here with these observational studies, a little bit of rodent stuff, and a little bit of mechanistic stuff. And so, at this point, I'm sure people are wondering, so what's going on? Does this stuff actually cause cancer? Um, when it comes to the rodent studies, those initial findings have largely been discredited by the scientific community. There are entire papers kind of critiquing the methods and the conclusions that were drawn from those papers. I think it's pretty safe to say that the scientific consensus is that those findings in rodents are unreliable and really shouldn't be weighed heavily when considering the human impact of aspartame intake. When it comes to observational findings in humans, there are some isolated findings where there's an increase in cancer risk associated with artificial sweetener intake, specifically aspartame. However, there are meta-analyses that kind of pool together. Like I said, with observational findings, we really want to rely on the broadest body of evidence and see, does this seem to be a really consistent pattern from study to study to study? And in short, the answer is really not. There are a couple meta-analyses that I cite in my most recent Mass article, the Mass Research Review, where I wrote about this topic. And if you look at the meta-analyses that look at the totality of the literature, they really don't give you much cause for concern in terms of cancer risk. There are a couple types of cancer for which, you might say, well, maybe there's a little increase in risk. There are even a couple types of, specific types of cancer where you might argue that there is a reduction in risk associated with artificial sweetener intake. But across the board, if we're just looking at the totality, the effect seems to be pretty much zero, pretty negligible in general. So that is enough to alleviate some concerns. The fact that, the main rodent data is probably not particularly credible, not particularly reliable for human use. The human data, there are some isolated findings, but that's true for a lot of things in nutrition. And if we look at the totality of the evidence, it doesn't really seem like there's much of a consistent link there between artificial sweeteners and cancer risk. But to me, one of the most important things about interpreting this particular announcement and the research behind it is the fact that they are looking, in the part that you talked about, they are looking at hazard rather than risk. Okay. And it's a really important distinction because a hazard is basically forgetting about the specific conditions and circumstances. Can this thing cause cancer? Whereas risk is asking, with a given set of circumstances, is it likely to cause cancer, right? So what that means is, like, hazard is there any possible potential that this thing could have a causative role in cancer arising? Whereas risk is more like, okay, but seriously, is it going to give me cancer, right? Is it going to give my family cancer? And so when we look at hazard, we're not really talking about the dose. We're not really talking about how frequently you're consuming it. We're not talking about, all of these important contextual factors when it comes to intakes of something. Risk is more related to like, okay, if I'm having a pretty typical amount on a regular basis for many, many years, how much is this really going to move the needle in terms of my likelihood of actually developing cancer? So I mentioned, you were talking about a part of that press release where they were talking about hazard. Could you maybe think of a scenario possibly where maybe aspartame could cause cancer? At this point, they're saying, well, I guess possibly, because there is some of this human stuff and some of this rodent stuff. None of it's particularly strong. And they even acknowledge that it's very limited evidence. Um, but at the same time that the IARC was doing this kind of investigation into aspartame and kind of making this report, another body of, I forget what it was called. It's some kind of joint, yeah, it's called the Joint Expert Committee on Food Additives. And so that's basically the FAO, which is associated with the United Nations. And then the World Health Organization is the other part of it. So it's kind of a joint group between the UN and the WHO. And they put out their kind of expert consensus on food additives. And what was really weird about the timing of all this is both of these organizations were reviewing aspartame at the same time, and then they released this stuff kind of basically at the same time. The IARC, I think, came out a little bit before the Joint Expert Committee came out. But basically, both organizations are affiliated with the World Health Organization, right? And so it led to this weird situation where the World Health Organization, through these two different reports, basically said, okay, we are making aspartame a group 2B possible carcinogen. And people say, oh my God, that's really scary. By the way, we are not changing our recommendation for the safe daily limit, which is really high. So like the safe daily limit, they call it the acceptable daily intake level, which is the way it's defined is an estimate of the maximum of amount of a food additive that a person can safely consume on a daily basis over their lifetime without an elevation in health risk. So like again, talking hazard versus risk, this isn't like can a thing cause cancer, but they're setting this acceptable daily intake saying, let's assume you're consuming this much every day, your entire life, and you don't want to run into any health risks associated with it. Where would we set that bar for aspartame? And the answer is currently 40 milligrams per kilogram, which, different diet sodas have different amounts, but that's like a 12 pack of diet soda a day. And it's important to recognize, I actually cut that definition short for the ADI. It's, consuming on a daily basis for your whole lifetime without any health risk, including a 100-fold safety factor. So they basically say, okay, what do we think is actually the appropriate amount? And then they kind of say, okay, but let's assume that we're way off and be extra conservative and implement this huge safety factor, and that's where we're going to put the ADI limit. So all of that is to say, the World Health Organization at the same time is saying, yes, this is a 2B possible carcinogen, but by the way, knock yourself out. Have a 12 pack of diet soda a day, like depending on your body weight, that's about what it comes out to. And like you're fine. And that's even with a massive safety buffer built into that estimate. And that sounds like I'm being critical, but I'm actually not, because I think if you look at how they do these categories and the levels of evidence that they're very transparent about, I actually do think aspartame belongs in the 2B group, because there is some of this kind of really weak, limited evidence. But I simultaneously don't worry about it at all as a person who consumes aspartame on a fairly regular basis, because most folks are going to be well within that limit, and that limit itself is very conservative. It's even lower. Like the United States Food and Drug Administration, they set their limit at 50 milligrams per kilogram rather than 40. And again, that's with an ultra conservative safety buffer that's kind of automatically built into those thresholds. So all of that is to say that a lot of folks saw this initial release, saying, hey, aspartame is possibly carcinogenic, but they didn't really, a lot of the news coverage didn't really look into what that really means in terms of the strength of evidence. In this case, the evidence is really, really weak, but that doesn't mean we should ignore it entirely, which is why it finds itself in 2B rather than 2A or even category 1. People weren't really talking much about the difference between hazard and risk, which in this case, the World Health Organization is basically saying there is hazard, but there's basically no risk if you're consuming within fairly typical intake levels, just relative to the averages that we see in the population. And then the final point that I want to make here is that if you were to say, I don't care about risk, I'm excessively conservative when it comes to managing my own health, and I'm going to avoid everything that falls in group 2B or 2A or group 1, that's going to be really hard. So like, the kind of just totally normal things that we see that fall into these types of groups would be things like progestins, which are used in some contraceptives, engine exhaust, ginkgo biloba extract, aloe vera extract, caffeic acid, which is in like almost everything. I mean, it's in coffee, wine, a bunch of different spices, applesauce, prunes, barley, rye. I mean, it's in a lot of stuff. And then we've even got things that just can't be avoided, like solar radiation, just being in the sun, things that are used in medical applications, x-rays, for example, and then things that we consume on a regular basis. So, for example, alcoholic beverages and processed meats, they're not in category 2B. They're not even in category 2A. Those are in category 1, right? And it's totally not unusual to see someone have, a hot dog and a beer. And it's like, that is 2 category 1 known carcinogens that you're consuming. But the reason you don't fret over it is because you're thinking about risk rather than hazard when you're managing your health behaviors. And you're saying, hey, I know I can have a beer, a couple times a month, and I don't expect that I'm immediately going to get liver cancer from that. So I think those are all important things to keep in mind. And it's important to recognize some of these totally mundane things, including just like drinking very hot beverages that actually find themselves in the same or the same hazard category or even higher hazard categories. So those are important things to consider, but big caveat to kind of end my monologue here. I never, my goal when I got into doing research, communicating about health, being a fitness professional, when I started this whole journey, this whole trajectory, my goal was to empower people to take their health into their own hands and to make decisions with adequate knowledge and information. Basically, my goal is to give people information so that they feel empowered and they feel like they have the self-efficacy to make their own decisions about their health and their medical risks and things of that nature. So it's not about forcing people into any particular decision. It's just, here's the information, here's the educational content. Do with that what do whatever you want with that, but do it in an informed way. And so I would never fault anyone who, let's say, for example, has a history of cancer. Maybe they've had a previous cancer diagnosis, or maybe they have many cancer diagnoses in the family, and so they're really on high alert for their potential to develop cancer. I would never dismiss or make light of anyone's decision to be hyper cautious about anything that could possibly be carcinogenic. Ultimately, we all have our own decisions to make when it comes to that type of thing. But I will say that as someone who has a lot of cancer in my family, and someone who's looked at a lot of this aspartame evidence up close and really dug into the data, I'm personally not adjusting my aspartame related habits based on this new categorization. The World Health Organization, through that joint committee, doesn't even really recommend changing habits necessarily. They didn't move their acceptable daily intake level at all based on this new categorization. But nonetheless, If you're someone who is just super hyper cautious and wants to do as much as they can to minimize any potential exposure to carcinogens, there's nothing wrong with avoiding aspartame or non-nutritive sweeteners. I mean, there is no dietary requirement. You're not going to, keel over from a deficiency of artificial sweeteners. So if you prefer to avoid them, there's nothing wrong with that.
Well, look at that. I thought I had you there, Dr. Flexer, but turns out you got me. Thank you so much for that answer. My very last question is, you mentioned lots of foods and even other non-foods that are included in these groups, like, for example, aloe vera extract, and we don't really worry about that in our daily life. So what I'm wondering is, why is it that we hear so much about artificial sweeteners, whereas these other foods and various items don't really come under fire at all, from in my experience at least?
Yeah, that's a good question. I could probably ramble about that for a while. I think there's a few different factors. So one is the appeal to nature fallacy that we talked about previously. It's just you're consuming these artificial chemicals that doesn't sound good. And so when we get any kind of confirmation bias that would lead us to say, see, I told you they're not good, we tend to give that a lot of attention. Um, so that's one element. I think another element is people with non-nutritive sweeteners have long viewed them as kind of too good to be true. There are not a lot of things where we could like very simply replace sugar in a food and say, yeah, and it just tastes pretty similar and there's just fewer calories and that's about it. It really does seem too good to be true. We've tried to do it with fat replacements and it generally hasn't caught on. Some of them have caused, diarrhea and malabsorption of fat soluble vitamin. They just haven't really panned out very well, and consumers basically just ditched them. So I think part of it is artificial, part of it is too good to be true. This kind of magic sugar replacer. Um, and then another thing is like there are some things that are so there are some things that are so impossible or unpalatable to modify that we just say, screw it. Right. So if someone said like, hey, Eric, turns out science is crazy. And this is a ridiculous example, but if someone said, hey, science is crazy and it turns out um, it actually is bad for you to sleep more than 4 hours a night. You've been sleeping like 8 hours a night, but if you cut that down to 4 a night, it's actually going to be better for you and you're going to live like 5 years longer. I'd rather live 5 fewer years and feel well rested every day, right? Like I'm not going to go and set an alarm and wake up at 3 in the morning every day and just honestly feel terrible every day for the rest of my life. So when we hear something like that, we say, screw it. I'll take the risk. Right. So
Yes.
like, I think for some of these things, it's like, yeah, caffeic acid, for example, it's found in coffee, wine, a bunch of different spices and herbs, cinnamon, applesauce, apricots, prunes, barley, rye. I mean, just a ton of different plant-based foods. And the animals who eat the plant-based foods, it's found in their tissues as well. And so if you told someone, hey, avoid caffeic acid, they're going to say, you can't. Like you just can't. And you shouldn't, to be honest. So I think for some of these things like solar radiation, it's like, what are you going to do, man? Like the sun exists. It just does. And, you get radiation exposure when you fly, when you go outside, when you get an x-ray. Like some of this stuff is just so impossible to avoid that I think we just say, whatever, dude, screw it. Same thing with with red meat being in the group, 2A. A lot of folks understand with, red meat in group 2A. I think it's in 2A, and then processed meat in group 1, alcohol in group 1. It's not a surprise to anyone that these food items are, maybe not the best things for you, if eaten, beyond moderation in really high amounts. But people have just kind of said, screw it. They've become so common within a lot of different food cultures. Um, and yeah, I think people say it'd be too much of a lifestyle modification to remove those entirely. So I'm just not going to worry about it and just say, okay, I'll take that risk and it's fine. I think artificial sweeteners are something that are, you know, we go into it assuming they're too good to be true, assuming that there must be a catch. We hear about this, it confirms our bias, and most people probably could remove artificial sweeteners from their diet without it feeling like the biggest sacrifice they've ever made. They wouldn't, maybe they wouldn't love it, but it's not like saying, "Hey, never have coffee or wine again." For a lot of people, that's just a no. So yeah, I think it's kind of a wide ranging answer, but I think for a lot of different reasons, it just finds artificial sweeteners find themselves in that sweet spot where they're the intake of artificial sweeteners is just modifiable enough to actually have the conversation of should we modify it for our health. And there are so many pre-existing uh, skeptical or suspicious viewpoints about it that it's always going to get this kind of attention.
Thank you for that perspective. I have got to say, I think at this point, I have enough of artificial sweeteners and aspartame to be happy to not change my current stance of consuming artificial sweeteners in a certain amount, a moderate amount at least, what I would consider moderate within the context of my own diet. So thank you very much for clarifying all of this, well, what turned out to be myths in the end about the risk of consuming aspartame and consuming other artificial sweeteners as well. Is there anything at all that we have touched on, but maybe not in detail enough, that you would like to clarify, or anything at all you'd like to say to wrap up this conversation?
Just one thing, I thought of a less stupid example, so I'm going to throw
Okay.
it out there. So, um, I talked about the things that have been speculated to be good for us, and we're just like, yeah, I'm just not willing to do that, right?
Yeah.
So, I admitted, no one's telling you to restrict sleep. Everyone knows sleep is awesome. You should get plenty of it. But two examples where I have seen this is, and these are not recommendations, by the way, but
Yeah.
there have been some rodent studies suggesting that pretty aggressive caloric restriction can extend lifespan, but it's got to be pretty extreme. And the same thing is true with certain organisms and protein restriction, but it's got to be pretty extreme. And so I've seen a lot of folks in the fitness world who are like, should I like go on a really, really, really low calorie diet and a really, really, really low protein diet for the rest of my life forever? And it's like, come on, dude, you don't want to live like that. You don't. And I don't even think it's viable, to be honest. But it is one of those examples where the reason that you don't hear a bunch of people hemming and hawing about whether or not they should do it is because no one's willing to do it, right? And I actually think the protein one is a terrible idea because the animal models it's based on don't really translate over well. But again, that's probably a better example where I've at least heard people kick the idea around, but it doesn't generate the same controversy of like, hey, should I cut aspartame from my diet? Because people will think about cutting aspartame from their diet. No one's going to go on a 1,000 calorie diet for the rest of their life and barely eat protein, right? It's just not going to happen. So
It's
um,
true.
but yeah, I think just wrapping up, like I said, if you really prefer to err on the side of caution, I don't make a fraction of a penny every time someone drinks a diet soda. I don't care if someone says, "Hey, I prefer not to." That's totally fine. But one of the reasons I like to get out and talk about this topic is because, like I said, I want to empower people to really take control of their health and make informed decisions. And part of that is just getting the information out. And I know a lot of folks who have found artificially sweetened beverages to be a helpful part of their weight management journey and part of the approach that they take. For a lot of folks, it's been a helpful way to have some nice palatable foods without, you know, um, getting all that sugar into their diet. It's a very feasible way to cut some calories from the diet. So I know a lot of folks heard this news and were kind of discouraged because they're like, man, I thought I had a good strategy that was kind of part of my plan that was helping me. And a lot of people were like, it kind of sucks that I have to get rid of that now. And I would propose that maybe you don't, based on the evidence.
Excellent. And folks, Nikias is back, Ken is gone. I just wanted to say that I completely agree with that. It's the reason why I invited you on the podcast, not once, but twice, and there will be more. It's because one of the cornerstones of my own coaching practice is the desire to empower other people to make informed decisions. So I'm really glad that we got to that, well, that you and Ken got to talk about this today. Thank you so much for your time. And in closing, I just like to offer you the opportunity to direct people to anything that you would like to plug about yourself or anything else that matters to you that you want to share with the audience.
Yeah. Once again, thanks for having me. I really appreciate it. It's always great to chat. If anyone wants to stay in touch with me or see what I'm up to, you can follow me on Instagram. My handle is @Trexler Fitness. And if you want to support some of the work we're doing or learn some things about fitness, the main thing I promote these days is I'm a co-author of the Mass Research Review. So every single month, my colleagues and I review the newest, most important research happening in fitness, exercise, nutrition, and we publish reviews of these new studies in a way that is, I think, very approachable, very practical. We basically try to help people stay on top of the current research, the newest science, and say, here's what they found, here's what you can do with it. And if you coach clients, here's how you can help others with this information as well. So if you want to learn more about that, you can go to massresearchreview.com. Like I said, I'm one of the co-authors, and my colleagues are Dr. Mike Zordos, Dr. Eric Helms, and soon to be Dr. Lauren Colenso Semple. So we're all researchers, and we're also all people who have a lot of coaching experience as well. So we try to make sure that we're keeping it scientific, but also keeping it really, really practical.
As an assiduous reader of Mass myself, I can only recommend this as well. And I am going to add the link to your Instagram account and the link to the Mass Research Review in the show notes. Thank you again, Eric. Thank you, dear listeners, for tuning in. And until next time.
Lastly, if you want to support the podcast and help me reach more people, please leave a 5-star rating or review on any podcast platform that you're using. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll speak to you soon.